On today's episode of the JB Podcast, we're going to talk about the surprisingly wild final day of the regular season. We're going to talk about the play-in teams, the previews of those matchups, and the disappointing teams of 2022-2023. Let's get into it. So the NBA season has concluded. I don't know about you guys, but it really went pretty fast for me. But the playoffs are here, and the play-in is here. And I gotta say, with previous play-ins, sometimes we were in situations. Well, we're kind of in a situation like that this year, where a team that we probably had expectations to be maybe even a little higher. I don't know about the Lakers, but the Lakers have LeBron James and Anthony Davis again playing in the playing game. And the Miami Heat, who were the 1 seed last year, I expected them to take a dip this season, but I didn't think they would dip this much. They're the 7 seed this year. They couldn't pass Brooklyn, as I predicted, to get to that 6th spot. And the Knicks improved dramatically this year. So it was a situation really where the Miami Heat dealing with injuries, but also just something's been up with them this entire season. And these playing games have something very different about them this year because I genuinely don't know what's going to happen. I think there's a possibility that in a single elimination game, you can have many different outcomes here, which is why I don't want to make playoff predictions yet because I genuinely don't know who the 7th and 8th seeds are going to be in each conference. And I do think that specifically in the Western Conference, depending on who the matchups are, the 1 seed Denver Nuggets and the 2 seed Memphis Grizzlies could be in trouble. Or that series could go longer than expected. And depending on if they get maybe another matchup, maybe it doesn't go as expected. In the Eastern Conference, I genuinely think it'll be a lot easier, but I still don't know necessarily who's going to make it out of them. So after yesterday, we cannot start off without acknowledging the dramatic game between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the New Orleans Pelicans. We don't care about the Pelicans side of things. We care about the Timberwolves. What a disaster of a situation that has kind of become. The Rudy Gobert trade was a trade that I did not like when it first happened. And mostly because I'm not the biggest fan of Rudy Gobert. I'm not saying he's a bad player, but he's a player that was declining in the last few years. He's not really old yet, but I don't see his game aging well. And since he signed that huge contract in Utah, he's always seemed as somebody as an overachiever. And he's also done a bunch of things personally that I'm not the biggest fan of, like when COVID was happening, right? He was touching the microphones. He's got a surprising amount of drama to him, despite there's really nothing special about the guy. Like he's a good defender. He was a late pick in the draft. Turned out to be a really excellent draft choice. Turned out to be on a really good Utah Jazz team. But ultimately, I think people working in analytics probably overrated him. You could say he caught a raw deal last year in Utah because that team wasn't really a great perimeter defensive team, and he had to carry a lot of that. But not only was that trade a disaster going into the season, knowing that they gave up Walker Kessler and a bunch of, I believe, was it 5 draft picks? First round unprotected picks, including a pick swap. It's just a team that Rudy Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns was a weird fit. Anthony Edwards is really young. He showed some, I believe this is his third season. It's a season where, you know, Minnesota, I guess, had great expectations after last year. They felt like they needed to dramatically improve. When really you could kind of just stay the course, right? You got a young team, things are getting better. Maybe you do something with D'Angelo Russell. Maybe you do something with Karl Anthony Towns, because it's clear that Edwards is surpassing Towns, or has been for the last 2 years. He's the guy that they want to build around. And Karl Anthony Towns in recent years has not been a player I've been a fan of, mainly because of his struggles in the postseason. But I don't like his defense, and although he's a great and talented offensive player, I don't think he's a high IQ offensive player sometimes. And he gets injured. So I'm not the biggest fan of Karl Anthony Towns, but he's a good player. I don't see, it was clear that they weren't sold with Towns at the 5 because Gobert would not have been brought in, because Gobert is a defensive center. So they clearly had no confidence in Towns in that way. They do have some size. It's just an awkward fit. And Towns can't guard 4s or anybody smaller than him. So he can barely guard 5s. So he's not quick enough to deal with that. So, but despite that, Minnesota won the game. This craziness on the bench with Kyle Anderson, who's a player that I've always loved. Jersey kid. Well, he's not really a kid. He's older than me, but Jersey guy. So, he apparently, there was the report that he said, why aren't you blocking more shots? And Gobert said, why aren't you grabbing more rebounds? And then Kyle Anderson said, shut the fuck up, bitch. And he got hit in the shoulder. Now, that's, if I'm Rudy Gobert, I don't want to be called that, but nothing is going to end well if you throw that punch. And, if I was in that situation, which I get it, I'm not in Rudy Gobert's shoes, you don't want to be called that, obviously. But, there is something to, like, the season not going as expected, and a lot of it is because you're not stepping up to what you need to be. But you could also argue it's the fault of the organization for overrating Rudy Gobert. It's kind of like the Kyrie Irving effect, which we'll get into later. Like, Dallas brings in Kyrie Irving, right, and they're not winning. But is it Kyrie's individual fault? Not really. It's just the organization overvalued what he brings to the table. So the other little news here, which I actually think is an even bigger deal, because I think Timberwolves can play without Rudy Gobert. But Jaden McDaniels punches a wall because he gets in foul trouble, and he's out for the season with a broken hand. I don't understand. We have a decent amount of history now. The one I can really remember is when Amari Stoudemire punched a fire extinguisher, broke his hand. He was out for the series versus the Knicks back in versus the Knicks when he was on the Knicks. This was versus the Heat, 2012. Knicks really didn't have a chance to win that series, I would say, but they had talent. Like, I think they went down 3-0, or was it? I think it was down 3-0, and Stoudemire just punched a fire extinguisher and, severely injured his hand. It's like nothing good's going to come out of that. The Timberwolves were going to be in the play-in no matter what, and it was just a stupid move by Jaden McDaniels. Hopefully he learns from it. He's a talented kid. I would say he's one of the most important players. But despite that, they got the win yesterday. And the Pelicans, they've gone through their share of drama this year. They completely fell off a cliff after the Zion injury. They got back Ingram. They still weren't great, but Ingram's played really well recently, and they've kind of righted the ship a bit. But they're still a 9th seed, and they're going to be playing in 2 playing games to get to the postseason, which is disappointing knowing where they were at one point in this year. I saw them play opening day versus Brooklyn in person, and they looked like they were a force. Like, this year they were going to be a big problem. And unfortunately, this whole Zion situation, he just can't stay healthy, and I think a lot of it is self-earned. He's not taking the best care of his body. And and Zion is somebody that he's kind of not even really learned how to play the game yet. Like, he's still kind of a kid, and he still looks incredible when he's out on the floor. And, like, just incredible. And it's everything that you want as a player. He can't even really shoot yet. So he's not going to be available in this Pelicans run, which is, really affecting my thoughts on how far they can go. But last year, they did go pretty far, and they did make some noise. But now we're going to preview, and now that that's over with, because honestly, I don't want to talk too much about that, but the Minnesota Timberwolves situation, it was kind of heading towards a situation like this with all the talk about how poor the Rudy Gobert trade was. Not really sure what they were thinking in the offseason, but they did it. It's like beating a dead horse at this point. The D'Angelo Russell trade that happened at the deadline, they wanted to get a grown-up, in air quotes, right? And Mike Conley, I actually like Mike Conley's fit a lot there, but he is an aging point guard. And you don't know how many good years you're going to get from Mike Conley. So, do I like him with this team? Yes. But his contract is also a little high. And that could be a very bad contract because he doesn't have great size as a point guard. He's just a little crafty left-handed guard who, can get to certain spots. Good lob guy for Rudy Gobert. But after this punch, I'm curious to see this offseason what they do with Rudy Gobert or Towns. Like, this Timberwolves team is really strange. However, they did win that game. So let's get that into discussion because in regards to the play-in, I think the Lakers are going to win. They're one of my teams that I actually think you need to keep an eye on for the actual playoffs. The Timberwolves-Lakers game is going to be a good one, I think. But I'm choosing Anthony Davis and LeBron James. I think they're going to be at home. This team is probably better than a 7 seed because the team that they started out with at the beginning of the year that went 2-10, they're a different team. So I believe they're 43-39. That's what they finished in. They had a chance to even go higher than that, try to get to the 5th seed, 6th seed. They needed to win a few more games to do that, especially that Clippers one, which they can't beat the Clippers. I don't know why. I don't know why they can't beat the Clippers, especially because the Clippers are kind of a mess themselves. But the Lakers are in this situation where they're the 7th seed, and honestly, the Clippers are playing the Phoenix Suns, who I don't think they're going to beat. So you're in a situation where you could play a Memphis Grizzlies team that they showed vulnerability in the playoffs last year despite losing Ja and kind of making it interesting with Golden State. I'm not sold on Memphis. This year was a very odd year, and yet they find themselves as the number 2 seed. So I think the Lakers have looked better in the recent months. So I think they're going to win that game versus Minnesota. The game, Pelicans versus Thunder. I also think the Pelicans are going to take easy care of the Thunder. To me, this is the worst game, probably, because it's not that I don't think Oklahoma City doesn't deserve to be there. It's just, obviously in one game, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander can do many things. He's been arguably the best shooting guard in the league this year, if you consider durability. I don't know if I'd take him as the number 1 best shooting guard in the league, but he's been up there. And I just don't know if they really want to win this game, to be honest. I don't know if they really are interested because they've kind of finished the season flat. And if Dallas wasn't such a disaster, OKC's probably not even in the play-in. So, and knowing that the Pelicans kind of have all this pressure on them to make it happen, and they've played pretty well at the end here, I'm just going to take New Orleans. I think Ingram's going to be good, and they got a good coach. Obviously, OKC's got a good coach. I don't know. I just don't like the way OKC has played at the end of this year. And I think it's going to carry into it. I don't know if they really care about making the playoffs. I think the Pelicans really care about making the postseason. So that is a reason why I'm just going to pick them. It has nothing to do with X's and O's. I could argue that Shea Gilgeous-Alexander is a better player than Brandon Ingram. I don't think too many people would disagree with me on that. But the Pelicans have a talented roster behind Ingram. So, and New Orleans is going to have that home court. So that's what I expect. I expect New Orleans to take care of business. I expect the Lakers to take care of business and go to that 7th spot, face the Memphis Grizzlies. As far as that 8th spot, fighting for that 8th spot, Pelicans, Timberwolves. I actually am going to go with the Timberwolves, and here's why. I just like Anthony Edwards better than anybody on the Pelicans roster. I like Anthony Edwards. I think Minnesota could be a very idiotic team at times, right? Last year, you could argue they should have beaten the Memphis Grizzlies, and they didn't because of poor endings to games. Just Mike Conley is a good point guard. Anthony Edwards is a guy who I think who has top 10 player in the league potential. Karl Anthony Towns is talented. Postseason play is awful usually, so I can't like anything good from him. Even if he just gives you like a slightly efficient 20 points, I think is a plus. Rudy Gobert will probably play in that game. It's been announced today he's suspended for the Lakers game. Who knows if that even helps them. The big key though is Jaden McDaniels isn't there, but they do have Kyle Anderson. They do have Taurean Prince, who I hated when he was with the Nets. He was awful with the Nets. But he has played pretty well on the teams. He was in Cleveland. Now he's in Minnesota. He's played pretty well in those spots. And I think Minnesota likes him. So I think he can give you some good production. And Chris Finch is a pretty good coach. Offensively. So I'm going to take the best player in this game, and I think Edwards is the best player, although Ingram has shown in postseason play he could be dangerous. That's going to be a good game. It's going to be similar to Sundays because those guys were playing for something. It's going to be a good game. New Orleans has CJ McCollum. They don't have Zion, right? But they still have a lot of guys who could play. So I expect that to be a really good game, but I'm taking Minnesota despite the drama because it's just a situation where I just believe in their talent more, despite Towns' checkered playoff past, if you could even call it checkered. He's only been in there twice, and he's been awful in both. I just think Edwards is a guy that I just really believe can take them to the postseason. And that would be an interesting series, Denver, Minnesota. So those are my thoughts on the Western Conference play-in teams. Next, quickly talk about the East because I don't necessarily want to talk about these teams too much. Hawks Heat. I have no idea who's going to win this game. I'm picking Miami mainly because I hate what I've seen from Atlanta this year. They've been so weird. In my opinion, Atlanta's the way more talented team. They got a new coach. They had a bad loss to Philly the other day where Philly wasn't even trying to win and they still beat them. Trae Young's shown greatness in great moments in the playoffs before. He was bad last year. Miami seems to figure out what Atlanta does, although this is a completely different Miami team. I've hated watching Miami this year, but Jimmy Butler is someone I'm going to take in a game than Trae Young at this point. So I'm going to take the Miami Heat. They're going to be home. That home crowd really isn't too great, honestly, but I think they've seen good basketball before and they'll be there to cheer on their team. Jimmy Butler is somebody that I just believe more than anybody I do in Atlanta. Even DeJounte Murray. DeJounte Murray has moments. He might have peaked last year with that all-star nod in San Antonio. But he's a guy who also didn't play well last year in the play-in. So I don't know how much you can count on him. John Collins has had a bad year. Shooting the ball has just been terrible. I mean, part of the reason why Atlanta has struggled is because John Collins can't space the floor as much as he did, shooting 29% from three, I believe. Just not a great shooter. And they needed him to be more than that. Can Atlanta beat Miami? Sure, because I think Miami kind of stinks. But I'm just going with proven Eric Spoelstra and Jimmy Butler. Quinn Snyder, I don't think has been there long enough to really change anything to really make me consider him as a positive at this point. Next year, I think, is going to be his time to really have his mark on the organization. But for now, I'm taking Miami. Now, the other play-in, Bulls Raptors. I'm taking Toronto. I'm taking Toronto mainly because of that home crowd and their length, and I think they got players that I like. Chicago has a bunch of players I don't like, and honestly, like DeRozan, with his postseason struggles, like he may want to go into Toronto and kind of give it to Masai. I think that's something to look out for. Chicago's playing pretty well lately. Pat Beverly seems to have an impact on them. We'll see what Zach LaVine can give him. Vucevic has played better than the disaster that he looked in the beginning of the season. But I just like the Toronto roster better. Despite the Toronto flawed roster here, they got guys that have been there. And despite that they all seem to hate Nick Nurse now, and he's going to be gone, it looks like, and he'll probably be in Houston this summer. That's just my guess. Him or Udoka will be in Houston. We'll get into that later. They're a team that they played much better the second half of the season after the trade deadline once they weren't in trade rumors. I think they're going to win that game. And I think they have a really good chance against Atlanta. So I got Toronto beating Chicago. Chicago will have a very interesting offseason because then probably not going to keep that draft pick. And we'll get into that later. Atlanta versus Toronto. I'm going to take Atlanta here. I think Trae Young's going to kill Fred VanVleet, personally. And I think after losing to Miami team, Atlanta's just too talented for me not to pick them. And Toronto is just not good enough at shooting the basketball. Although Atlanta's not a great shooting team either. But they still got Bogdanovich and guys like that. To me, this is a toss-em. Like honestly, with some of these playing games, the East is a toss-em. Whoever these teams come out of the play-in, they're gonna lose in the first round of Boston or Milwaukee, and I just don't see it. I just don't see them being competitive in those series. So ultimately it doesn't matter. I got the Hawks being that 8th spot versus the Bucks. I think that could be the most interesting one because they faced 2 years prior. I think the Bulls have a chance. I think the Raptors have a chance. I'm taking Miami and Atlanta. It's just what I'm doing. But enough about the play-in. We'll see what happens. Once the play-in games are complete, I'm going to release another podcast on Friday night, so you can listen to it Saturday morning, giving my playoff predictions after the bracket is completely figured out. But this seems like the perfect time to discuss the play-in teams, not the play-in teams, but the teams that didn't make the play-in, and my thoughts on them and how their season went, and why I think that either I think they're heading in the right direction, or I think they're heading in the wrong direction, or was I disappointed in them, or was I briefly surprised with them, and ultimately what I think their future is going to look like going forward. So the one I'm going to start with is Dallas, right? So I don't mean to say I told you so to Dallas Mavericks fans, but man, did this Kyrie Irving thing not work in the second half of the year. Now I'm not saying he's not staying, because you'll see a lot of people say there's no way Kyrie Irving's staying and all this, right? To me, Kyrie Irving's staying in Dallas. And the reason why is because they have no alternative. Now, I know he didn't make the exit meeting, which again is another reason why I wouldn't have this guy on my team. He skipped the exit meeting just to avoid the media, didn't want to answer questions. Like, if he left, I would not be shocked at all. But knowing that I don't think other teams are going to want him as much, plus, like, I don't think the Lakers are as desperate as they were at the deadline. I don't think I think the Clippers could possibly be a team you look at maybe for a sign and trade, but they can't sign him out front. Maybe Miami wants to do something with him, but again, who are they going to really give up that Dallas would want? To me, Dallas overpays for him, and he comes back to Dallas, and they try to fix the rest of their roster. I actually think Jason Kidd stays there. Dallas Mavericks fans, everyone rips Cuban recently for the tanking of the draft pick, and it was shameful. It was shameful, especially after Kyrie basically saved their season versus Sacramento. It looked like it was a game that they looked like they were going to lose, and Kyrie just pulled off and went crazy, and they won. So you could see a path for Dallas to get in the play-in, and they just had no confidence in this team, which is so funny because why even make the Kyrie Irving trade in the first place if you're not going to follow through with it? They really want this 10th pick. It makes sense that they want the 10th pick because they have no assets. And it's oddly enough, it's the pick that they traded for in the Porzingis trade. Smart to put on protection on that because it didn't work, that Porzingis trade. Because not only did Porzingis not gel with Luka, but they got Dinwiddie, and Dinwiddie worked with Luka, and then they lost Brunson, and then they traded Dinwiddie to Brooklyn and Dorian Finney-Smith, their best wing defender, who they put on their other team's best players, and they lost him, plus their 2029 unprotected pick, plus 2 second-round picks for Kyrie Irving, who is, let's just say he's not all there in some aspects. He played really well in Dallas, and they lost, which is a common theme you'll see in Kyrie Irving basketball teams. As far as Luka goes, he's not blameless here. This is another co-star that he doesn't seem to win with. He had moments with Porzingis where it looked good, and then he had moments with Porzingis where it's like, I'm not getting along with you. The one he worked the best with was Jalen Brunson. And Dallas failed to bring him back. But Jalen Brunson, as much as I think how is impressive how he's been with the Knicks this year, Kyrie's more talented than Jalen Brunson. I'd rather have Jalen Brunson on my team now, but it's not like Kyrie Irving's just this bum. He's an extremely talented player who's also small like Brunson, and he's probably a little bit more he is more explosive if that means anything to people there. But let's just look at Kyrie Irving's past, man. Just look at Kyrie Irving's past, and at some point, it's got to stop being everybody else's fault here. So as much as I don't blame everything on him in Dallas, at some point he's going to do something that's not helping. He's just not the solution there. What they got to do is do their best, squeeze everything they can into getting some solid defensive players around those guys. And I don't know how they're going to do it. To me, they're in one of the worst situations in the league, and honestly might be the worst. So those are just my thoughts on Dallas. That's all I have to say. I talked about them before and how I didn't think that was going to work, and so far I am looking right. So, yeah. Talking about Utah. Utah surprised a lot of people at the beginning of this season. They're going in a direction that I really like. I think we'll see what happens with the whole Lauri Markkanen situation. He's going to the Finland army this summer, I believe. Hope everything works out over there for him. But he's a really good player, and we'll see what they go. They got Danny Ainge there, who's rebuilt a lot of nice teams before. Some of the players that he drafted in Boston at one point before Brad Stevens took over didn't look great when he drafted them, and now they look really good because they've developed, like Robert Williams, Grant Williams, even though Grant Williams has had a bad year this year. Peyton Pritchard, another guy. So I like the way, and they made those Westbrook trade, and they got guys there now that are gonna play hard. Like Taylor Horton Tucker is a guy that I was not a fan of in LA, but he came to Brooklyn recently and he played really well. So they got a bunch of guys that you could see having pretty good careers. Walker Kessler is a guy that totally you could build around, I think. It's just a matter of these guys just continuing to develop. They got a good coach, and I think pretty good retool year because with Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert there, they weren't going anywhere. So they have all these assets. They have all the assets from the Donovan Mitchell trade and the Rudy Gobert trade, and they got young talent on their team they could build around, and they're going to have their draft picks. So bright future for Utah, and had some moments of excitement this year. And Lauri Markkanen's a good guy also to keep. So I expect Jordan Clarkson not to be there, though. Portland, another shameful year for Portland. And can we talk about Damian Lillard for a second? So Damian Lillard talks about he's better off without a super team or whatever. And what? So now recently you're hearing like, oh, he could part ways with Portland. Like, what is it, man? You staying in Portland or you're not staying in Portland? Because stop acting like you're above it and then be like, oh, but I just want to win. Like, bro, you're just like everybody else. I expect Damian Lillard to be gone this summer. I just don't believe his words. Like Portland's better off if they trade him anyway. So they need to start from the bottom. It's too late. Honestly, all Damian Lillard's done is given them some really good games, obviously, but he scored 70 plus this year. But he's ultimately wasted their time in some ways because Portland doesn't have the assets to make that team better. And that team could be good in a few years, but they had a pretty good start to the season. But by that point, Damian Lillard's going to be, 35, 36 years old, and he's a smaller guard with a lot of miles on him at that point. Sure, he could shoot, obviously, but is he going to be the Dame Lillard that you think? I don't know. It wouldn't shock me if he's back next year, but honestly, I think he could be dealt because Shams' reports recently say that they're eyeing that. And all I got to say is Damian Lillard, wish you all the best, but, I guess those loyalty comments don't, they sound good, and then obviously when you obviously have to go through with them, then it's not so great. And Chauncey Billups, I'm not sure is a good coach either. I think this was a year where he could prove it. He said a lot of stuff last year that I think rubbed players the wrong way. He called out guys. Udoka did that, but Udoka also went to the finals. So Chauncey Billups didn't have a team talented enough to make the playoffs. But I don't think his team was bad. Like, he had Jeremy Grant, right? He had it's unfortunate that Nurkic took a step down, but Sharp was a good rookie they had, and they had Josh Hart. Like, Josh Hart's on the Knicks. I didn't really understand the Josh Hart trade. Like, everyone was talking about what they had to get rid of him. I'm not really sure. Like, if your plan is to win, and keep Damian Lillard happy, I think Josh Hart's a guy every team would want if you want to win. They settled for getting rid of him, getting Matisse Thybulle and Cam Reddish, two players that, again, talented in ways, but I don't see them having very long careers. So Portland, disastrous season, and they should trade Damian Lillard because Damian Lillard's value is getting worse. They should have done it 2 years ago, if we're being honest, because Lillard's stock right now is not going to be great with that contract that they gave him, and the fact that he's had now some injuries the last 2 years, and his teams have been good enough in times to maybe make the 8th seed, and he hasn't been able to do it. So I think teams are going to be more hesitant to trade for him now because he's older. So if I'm Portland, trade Damian Lillard this offseason. It was a good run. He scored 70 points this year. I think it's time. I think it's time has run out. I think Blazer fans want him. You want a fresh start anyway. Houston, 14, 22 and 60. I this Houston Rockets team. Hated it. Jalen Green is talented. I think he's got a future. I don't understand. Steven Silas was somebody that I never thought was a great coach. I feel bad for him because he kind of thought he was going to coach Westbrook and Harden, and he never did. And then the whole John Wall situation, and Kevin Porter Jr. is talented, but he's kind of a nutcase sometimes, and he gets in trouble, and they don't listen to the coach, and it's an undisciplined team. I like Şengün. And then Jabari is a good player. I probably expected a better rookie season from him this year, but this Rockets team has got some talented guys, but they're just not good enough, and they're too young, and I think they need more of a veteran presence in that locker room. I guess Eric Gordon wasn't it. They need a new coach, and I wonder if it's going to be Nick Nurse or Ime Udoka. If I were them, I would hire Ime Udoka, because I think Ime Udoka could get those guys to listen. I said this when it happened. I don't think the James Harden trade is going to be as good as they think. Now, obviously, they could get James Harden back this summer. I think there's a good chance James Harden comes there this summer, because why else would that be out there? I don't know. And if Philly doesn't get past the second round, which I think they're not going to, James Harden's going to go back to Houston. So if Harden goes to Houston, you're hearing rumblings about Jaylen Brown, trade rumors, or a free agent target. And if you can get James Harden and Jaylen Brown, ultimately, what's Jalen Green there for then? I guess you could have Jalen Green run the 2, and you have Jaylen Brown at the 3. I don't know. Şengün is really good, though. I like Şengün a lot. And the new coach, I think, is probably needed. But ultimately, I don't think that Harden trade is going to be as good as people think, mainly because, obviously, when he left, and then obviously when Kyrie got traded, it looked like Houston was going to get the entire future of Brooklyn, and oh my God, and plus they may get Harden back anyway. So basically, you traded Harden, and you're getting the Brooklyn picks plus James Harden back, because Harden obviously loves it there in Houston. I just don't think Brooklyn's going to be bad. Usually when you trade stars like this, I think Houston probably assumed that Brooklyn would start to be bad 2 years from now, right? And they traded those guys way sooner than anybody expected. And it actually probably helped the Nets, because the Nets Houston's not going to swap picks with the Nets this year, because Brooklyn's in the playoffs, and Houston is the number 2, I believe they have the number 2 odds or something like that for the pick of the draft, number one pick in the draft, number 3 or something like that, number 3 best odds. So they're not going to do that this year. And this is probably going to be the worst. This or next year will probably be the worst the Nets are in these, unless they completely botch this rebuild, which Sean Marks did a really good job rebuilding this team before. He just happened to get stars in there that A, took no accountability, B, weren't fully committed, and C, weren't good enough leaders. So it's a situation where I don't think those draft picks are going to be as valuable. They're going to be mid to late teens, or early 20s, in my opinion. I mean, just look at the Nets this year. They did not fall off the map like I expected them to. I didn't think they were going to fall off the map. A lot of people did. I saw Mikal Bridges' stats in January. A lot of people who follow Mikal Bridges and the Nets knew that Mikal Bridges was going to get an expanded role in Brooklyn, and he's playing really great. Shocked me that he's playing this good, but I knew he would be good. And Cam Johnson's going to be there. Nick Claxton's young. We'll see what happens with Cam Thomas. Cam Thomas is did disappear in the last month. He scored 46 on Sunday, but kid's got to learn how to play with other talented players. Spencer Dinwiddie's a good player. Dorian Finney-Smith's a good player. Those guys are under contract. They're going to have flexibility. They have draft picks now from Phoenix and Dallas, and they're going to be able to make that team good. So I don't think Houston... Now, listen, they're draft picks. Draft picks are draft picks. But if they're mid-first round or early 20s, I don't know if that's necessarily worth the James Harden deal, but because they didn't get anybody back in that trade that they could build around. Like, it would have been it would have been different if they got Jared Allen back in that trade. But I believe if you look at it, I think they got Victor Oladipo, who they turned into like Kelly Olynyk or something like that. It's just a weird trade that I don't think was a great one for Houston. And honestly, I don't believe in that GM at all. So we'll see what Houston does. But I think, like, oddly enough, I feel better about them because of the rumors that are surrounding them. And if James Harden goes there, then maybe Harden can bring some guys there. Who knows? But I'm not a big fan of that GM. And the coach getting fired is not shocking to me. And I just don't like the players on that team despite their talent. But I do like Şengün. San Antonio Spurs, they're trying to get Victor Wembanyama. And Greg Popovich probably won't be there very long. Julian Champagnie's killing it, St. John's guy. So always rooting for them. So I hope he sticks around because he was cut from the 76ers to make room for Mac McClung. But Champagnie's putting in work for San Antonio. Now they're losing, and they're losing on purpose, right? This is a tanking season. And if they get Victor, that'd be great. But they're in a rebuild. All I have to say, have some nice players that I like Trey Jones. I think he's pretty good. Who else is on that team? Johnson, right? He's good. So, yeah, I mean, and listen, Popovich at this point is Popovich. Like, he's older. Yeah, I mean, just San Antonio is a team that's just kind of like, all right, whatever, they're losing. So they're in a rebuilding year, not much to say. They'll probably be bad again next year, even if they get Victor. But we'll see. Now, moving on to the Eastern Conference, talk about the Indiana Pacers. I like the direction they're going in. Tyrese Halliburton had a great year. That injury that happened to him obviously stalled that Pacers team. Miles Turner, good player. Like, probably the best Miles Turner's ever been. Had a really good season this year. And he got that extension. He can still be traded, of course. But I think, like, he's the guy you want at your center position. He defends well and he spaces the floor. Like, he's a good player to have. And they got some young guys on there that could really help and develop. They got a good coach and Buddy Hield, pretty good shooter. We'll see what they do with him. I don't know about Duarte. I just don't know. Duarte was a guy that I kind of liked when they first got him, and I don't know. He's just gotten worse. Neesmith showing some things, right? They got, Rick Carlisle is a guy that I just like, as a coach. I've always liked him as a coach. He struggled a little bit at the end in Dallas and had some butting heads with Luka and some of their stars. I know some guys aren't a fan of him, but I do think he's a good coach. He showed that this year. And then Benedict Mathurin, like, he's the guy that, you can hope steps up to a real all-star, right? And Indiana's going to have their pick this year, so they could really build off that momentum. So I think when you're also looking at the East, those other teams, they have a real shot to possibly get into the play-in playoffs next year. I mean, they were in that picture this entire year, and they just kind of ran out of gas at the end of the year. All right, the Washington Wizards, man, this team is such a mess. And this GM, I don't really know what he's doing. It's funny, they were the team that made sense for Russell Westbrook to me because, he had success in Washington. Washington fans, I think, liked him a lot, and he could help them get into the play-in that they so desperately crave. The Bradley Beal thing, it's like he's just not worth this money. I don't understand it. They should have traded him because I don't think he's worth that money, and I think he could help other teams. But also, like, if you're Bradley Beal, like, if you ever watch the Wizards, like, you can't tell the difference, like, sometimes when he plays and he doesn't. It's very strange. It's like he's always been seen as this great three-point shooter, and he's streaky, and, I guess the only thing they got going is Porzingis had a really good year, but how many times are you going to get a really healthy season from Porzingis that's really effective? Like, I don't know how long. Like, seriously, and is he a guy that you could build around to go back? To me, Washington just needs to get rid of those guys and just build from the bottom up. They don't really have, like, Kuzma's a good player that could help other teams. Like, you can get some assets from him. You could probably trade Porzingis to a team with assets and eventually, and you got Bradley Beal's contract is so big, and they gave him a no trade clause. I just don't get it. I just don't get it. They're not good at drafting either. Their draft pick last year, like, barely played 10 games. I believe. So just didn't work out. It was a lottery pick, and I don't understand how that even happens. Orlando. This team, I think, is going to make the playoffs next year. I'm a big fan of this Orlando team. I'll see. I can't wait to see how they improve the roster. But ultimately, they got young guys, and then hopefully you see some growth from Suggs next season because he's kind of been a little slow to get going. But next year will be his third year. He's been a good defensive guard. It's just the offensive game just hasn't been there. Wendell Carter Jr. is a better center than Vucevic probably at this point, and it's one of the guys they got from him. They get Chicago's pick if it doesn't fall in the top four, which, you never know. But if it's looking like that, the odds are stacked against Chicago retaining that pick. Franz Wagner is an awesome player. Paulo Banchero is just an awesome. He's going to be Rookie of the Year, and he's going to be a guy you could definitely build around. And he has the potential to be one of the top tier guys in the league. Cole Anthony and Markelle Fultz could be like bench scorers for you. Like, those guys don't need to start. Like, those guys could be valuable players on a really good team. I just like Orlando's team, and I wish Jonathan Isaac just didn't get hurt all the time, and because he could also, like, bring some nice value to that team. That guy defends. He's got some good skills offensively. Like, I hope he figures it out with his health, but and I think their coach is pretty good. So Orlando is one of those teams. I think they finished the year out. I don't remember the record exactly, but I remember hearing, like, last week that their record at the second half of the year or something was like 27-24. Like, that was their last 41 games or something like that, before they started tanking the year. So after a rough start, they kind of grouped it together, and Orlando desperately needs an exciting team for that organization. They have not, the Evan Fournier, Nikola Vucevic, teams that made the playoffs, DJ Augustine, like those teams that made the playoffs 2 years in a row, it's just boring. Like, you knew they were going out in the first round. Like, Steve Clifford was the coach. Just like, what? They were just complete whatever teams. They got a guy in Paolo that is at the level of a guy as they've had in the past, like Dwight Howard, Shaq, Tracy McGrady. Like, they have a guy that they could really build around, and they got good young role players that they, not even just role players, guys who could be all-stars in their future, like Franz Wagner. Guys that could really help that team have a really bright future. And who knows? We'll see if they add a guy in free agency or they trade for a guy to get even better. Maybe you never know. Maybe they're in, like, a Damian Lillard trade, right? Maybe Dame goes to Orlando and all of a sudden that team is Dame, Franz Wagner, and Paulo Banchero. Like, with Wendell Carter Jr. Like, that's a team that could really, like, do something in the coming years. Next is the Charlotte Hornets, one of the most depressing teams in the league. LaMelo Ball is all they got going for them. Michael Jordan looks like he's going to sell that team. They're in the middle of that ownership change. Honestly, probably what's best. Michael Jordan was a bad owner, and they should just clean house. Didn't understand the Steve Clifford hiring at all, and Mitch Kupchak is not a great GM, in my opinion. Has not done a good enough job in the last few years. I didn't understand the Borrego firing, maybe because they got blown out in the play-in, but I didn't understand that. I think it said a lot that Kenny didn't want to come back. Kenny took the job and then didn't want to go take that job, like, right after that. I think it says a lot about that. So Charlotte needs a lot of looking in the mirror. I don't even like their players. Like, PJ Washington is, like, whatever at this point. they just have guys that I'm just not the biggest fan of. And I feel bad because, like, Charlotte's had times where, like, they dodged a bullet with the Kemba Walker stuff. But Terry Rozier is probably like a six man on a championship team. Like, he's not a starter, right? He probably not even a six man. Like, he's probably like maybe an eighth guy. It's just a weird team that they have a crazy announcer, so that's good for them. Makes their games more exciting, maybe. But we'll see what happens in their future. I don't know if they deserve Victor Wembanyama, but we'll see. And Detroit. Detroit, that I always think is going to, like, this is a year where Detroit's going to improve. Never really happens. They really were trying to get Victor this year. This is the team that I'd like Victor to go to, mainly because I want to see him and Cade Cunningham together. I'd like Sadiq Bey. I didn't understand the trade. James Wiseman. I don't know why you'd want James Wiseman. Could be a mistake, but I just haven't liked what I've seen from James Wiseman. I don't understand why they made that move, really. So I think maybe because they just don't feel like paying Sadiq Bey, and they eventually will have to. And now he's in Atlanta, and like he's playing well for them, but Atlanta again is not really doing anything. So like Detroit has some guys where I like ultimately the Cade injury screwed up everything, right? Jaden Ivey could have a bright future, but ultimately the Cade Cunningham injury affected what they were going to do this year. And if they get Victor, that's the team I want. Dwayne Casey was also a guy I was like, this guy can't be coaching Detroit that much longer, right? I mean, he was coaching that Blake Griffin, Andre Drummond team. And he'd been there long enough, and I just think it was time. Like, the team was not playing well, and, we'll see where Casey goes. But I don't... Casey's one of those guys where I don't know if he'll even get another job opportunity. He may be he may be an assistant, mainly because of his age, and didn't work out in Toronto, now didn't work out in Detroit. But we'll see. But I believed he stepped down, and it made sense to me. It sounded like his voice might have been tired in Detroit, and the team struggled so much. And Troy Weaver released that statement saying they apologized to Detroit fans. It's like, it would be nice to see a really good team in Detroit. And for a minute there, I was like really excited of what the Pistons were building, but. And I could be overreacting. It could be just, and they have Bogdanovich too, who I think is nice that they keep, and we'll see if they trade him, but I think it's nice that they keep. I mean, if you could be rolling out a team next year with Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, and if you look out in the lottery and you get Victor, and then you get Bogey in there, like that's a team that you can see, like, okay, I can see where you're going. I think you have a direction there, and new coach. Let's see, they got to nail that coaching hire. So I think Detroit is in a situation where they can improve, but man, this year felt like a step back. Like we knew they weren't going to be great, especially after the Cade injury, but 17 wins, like it's just not good. Like it's depressing. So this team better be improving next year. And if I'm them, I think a goal should be at least 30 wins. Like this is going to be Cade's third year, Cade Cunningham, number one pick. Like, you better get some improvement next season, because otherwise that fan base is going to be annoyed. And they're doing the right thing, right? They for a long time they cared about making the playoffs, and the Stan Van Gundy years they were in like mediocre hell, right? They just weren't nailing draft picks. They were focused on keeping stars that weren't really stars anymore, like Drummond and Griffin, and they traded Tobias Harris, and like it was just a blah team. And now I think they could really push for an exciting future, but they got to nail these next few decisions. So those are my thoughts on the teams that didn't make the playoffs this year. Next podcast is going to be about my playoff predictions. We'll probably briefly go into awards, but next podcast is going to be about the playoff predictions and who I think is going to raise the Larry O'Brien Trophy this year. That's all for today. Thank you for listening to the JB Podcast. I'll see you guys this Friday.